We now come to our last study in Matthew chapter 27. Not our last study in Matthew. We still have one more chapter, and we will spend the final studies in Matthew chapter 28. We are going to be looking at Matthew chapter 27. We will be looking at verses 65 and 66. I will be reading out of the New English Bible. You may have your guard, said Pilate. Go and make it as secure as you can. So they went and made the grave secure. They sealed the stone and left the guard in charge. My father finished his working life as a security guard. There is nothing wrong with this job. When I read verse 65, I can read it in light of my experience. For most people in the English speaking world, maybe their experience of security guards is a more recent movie, Mall Cop. You know, you can look at that movie and get a sense of what a security guard is. Now, obviously, that's not going to be a fair take on the job in general, and it's most definitely not going to give you a fair understanding, a reasonable understanding of what a security guard meant in the day and age of Jesus. This is why it's not always enough to just read the scripture. The reality is, when I think of a security guard, I have a set of opinions through my dad or through that movie. And that's not going to help me as I think of Pilate, going, okay, let's phone up the local agency. We know these security guards are bonded. That's required legally. Let's get 4 of them and ship them down to the tomb. If we have that sort of sense and read into it, and let's be honest here, it's not always we stop and think these things through when we read scripture. Often what we do is just assume and presume without really thinking about it that certain ideas, certain views, certain ways of seeing the world are like our own. And that's why it's difficult to read scripture, because we often have to step back for a moment, reflect on, and actually see what is going on. The point is, do not think the guards that were posted at the tomb were like the security guard or your local shopping mall security guard. The guard the guard detail at the tomb were taken from the Roman military, and that is extremely, extremely important. In other words, they were professional soldiers. These were people who knew what they were doing and how to do it. Now, I'm not saying that modern security guards are not professional. I'm not saying they don't know how to do what they do. That's not my point. The point is that these people at the tomb were Roman soldiers first and foremost. They operated under a certain level of code of conduct that you would not find under or with a modern security guard. What do I mean? One of the basic tenets of being a Roman soldier is your responsibilities and what would happen if you did not maintain those responsibilities. One of the things that incentivized the guards was the fact that what happened on their detail could be used against them. In simple terms, if you had some Roman soldiers picked to guard some prisoners of war, if those prisoners of war escaped, those soldiers could be paid for that with their lives. So in other words, when those Roman soldiers were put at Jesus' tomb to guard, they understood the stakes involved. They were professional Roman soldiers in that sense. They understood that if they failed at their duty, they could lose their life. So when you realize that, it puts things in a slightly different perspective. They were not looking at this as some cushy detail where they could kick up the heels, maybe have a few drinks, pass out, and spend the night asleep and not worry about things. They understood that this was serious work, serious detail, and that they needed to be on their toes, in other words. In the previous section, we looked at some of the theories to explain away the resurrection. And a lot of these theories do not take seriously the Roman soldiers at the tomb providing guard details. Now, the other thing is the tomb was also sealed. And this would not mean it was impossible to get in. Understand that the tomb, by nature of its design, had a rock rolled in front of its entrance. It would take effort to move the stone. So that's one of the things that makes the story of the women coming to the tomb interesting. How in the world did they expect to roll the stone away? I'm not saying that they didn't have some muscles, but it would take a fair bit to roll it away. Remember that these tombs held bodies. And so when we say that Pilate sealed the tomb, we have to use that in a relative sense. We know, for example, completely irrelevant point here, but that the Romans knew about the use of concrete. I mean, if they wanted to really seal the tomb, he could have done that. But that would miss the point because a tomb, by its very nature, was designed to get into. Why? Because in a few months, maybe a year, they would go back in, gather the bones of the deceased, repackage them in an ossuary, find a shelf in the tomb, and put the ossuary on a shelf, and then the tomb would be ready for another body, or even in a few weeks after the burial of Jesus. Who knows? You might have need the tomb for a body. So Pilate could not permanently seal the tomb because that was not the purpose of a tomb in that sense. So the seal on the tomb would have been a wax seal with an imprint from the Roman government. In other words, not a real barrier to unsealing the tomb at all. What Matthew is doing here is setting the stage for the resurrection. Now, I'm not saying that Matthew is not recounting the true facts as they were. What I'm saying, he's also working on the level of crafting his story and narrative, and he is setting the stage for the resurrection. The resurrection did not just happen. It happened in a context where people were trying to ensure something like this could not and would not happen. The religious leaders had no real desire to know if Jesus could actually rise from the dead. Pilate was simply trying to move on to the next phase of his business as a Roman bureaucrat. And in that sense, the story of what was going on in the tomb at that time is timeless. People will simply want to move on. People are not interested in whether Jesus rose from the dead. We have to understand that people don't really care in some cases about these things. Why? Because they're more concerned with their life here and now. And that's why attempts to sometimes prove the truth of the gospel fail, because they don't address the real issue, which is people simply don't care. The religious leaders were not interested in finding out if Jesus could really rise from the dead, because they didn't care. Pilate didn't care. The only people who would care are the first generation of disciples. There will always be people who are more focused on their careers and their pursuits than the truth and reality of the gospel. Jesus' resurrection, in that sense, for some, will always be an inconvenience and an inconvenient truth at that.